I hope there's nothing wrong with our heater. It's not sounding very healthy. Well, that can be fixed with some batteries, but okay. So let us continue where we were yesterday. Okay. So we had seen yesterday 3 different opinions in the Rishonim as to what the difference between, why the Gemara makes a distinction. Mishnah actually, I'm wondering, we may be doing more damage. Maybe I should let John know that there's something wrong with the heater here.
You have reached Beth Abraham Yosef.
I think it's 301.
Please wait a moment.
Gentleman in the front, Robert.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. Thank you, Brian. Let me just let him know that the heater seems to be malfunctioning. Thank you. Okay, so we had seen 3 opinions yesterday as to why there's a difference when it is your right to protest foot traffic coming into the chutzner versus when it's not your right, when a neighbor is making noise using a hammer or using a loud mill to grind things. And so there were different opinions. The first opinion that we saw yesterday is that you really don't have a right to protest noise. You only have a right to protest people who are increasing your inconvenience of getting in and out of your courtyard. It's got nothing to do with noise. Another answer is that from the medievalists is that the only time that you cannot protest is if this is something that was there when you already had moved in, that the person has a precedent, right? So he quoted, let me just make sure I have this right. He had quoted Rabbeinu Yerucham as saying that if a person already had an established precedent, that's where you're not allowed to protest. But if a person did not yet have an established precedent, so then you're allowed to protest. And then he had brought the opinion of the Ramban and the Rashba, who says that the only reason, right, like I mentioned before, is because of the foot traffic, but not because of the noise. Okay, and then we had a third opinion, which is let me just make sure I have it. Right, he says it's the sheet of the Mordechai. It depends where the origination of the noise is coming from. If it's coming from the person's own property, then you cannot protest. If it's coming from a shared area, like the courtyard, then you're allowed to protest. But then he started to tell us, but there is an opinion of the Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch, which seems to be his own. It doesn't seem to be consistent with any of these opinions. And he says as follows. He says, the Ramah seems to give more rights to a neighbor who's annoyed by the sound. He quotes the Ramah as saying, he says that the Ramah writes that you're never allowed to protest noise making that's being done by your neighbor. And we have to understand what the Ramah's real whole shita is. So this is where we get to the Ramah. Now we're up to the Ramah. So we've seen the three opinions as to what the distinction of the Mishnah is. And now we're up to the three opinions. Now we're up to trying to understand the opinion of the Ramah. He says, "V'hinei yesh la'ayin madas harama b'inyan zeh, the lashon haramahu, the chol ma she'osa b'chanusa u'beveso, afilu lechatchila inin yecholim limchos ad kan l'shana." He brings an opinion that whatever you do in your own property, even if it makes noise, neighbors cannot protest. Umilashon zeh mashma b'pashtus, zedafkeim osa beveso v'rshuso hadin kach, it sounds like he's going like the opinion that says that as long as you're doing it on your own property, it's okay. No one can protest. It's only if you're doing it in a joint area that your neighbors have a right to protest. And then he writes, I'm just going to skip a few lines. Okay. He says, "V'hinei af im nimko diyochol lismoch v'lomer kimli kedas hatosos v'harashba v'siyatam." Even though a person might be able to say that I paskin, I the noisemaker, paskin like those opinions, the Tosfos and the Rashba, who say that noise is never a factor that can be protested. He says, but that's only if the neighbors are healthy. But if you're dealing with sick neighbors whose illness will cause their condition to be compromised when the noise is made by the hammer or whatever the noise is, then the Ramah writes that the neighbors are allowed to protest. The lav dafkem hu cholem mamash ela afilu im hu bari ela sheyadua she'ena yochol lisovlo. And furthermore, it seems from the opinion of the Ramah that even if the person is healthy, but he tells you, I cannot tolerate the noise, afal pi shesha'ar b'nei adam yocholim lisovlo, mikol makom hol v'hu kaptan v'istinis yochol limchos. But if a person says, I'm so fastidious in particular that I cannot tolerate it, then it seems from the poskim that he would have a valid claim. And he says, but it has to be well established that this is the fact. You can't just take the person's word for it. He would have to show you, he says, some kind of evidence that he has a condition. Okay. And I'm going to skip a lot of the rest of the stuff because it goes on and on and on. And I want to get to the
So is the Ramah saying that? So is the Ramah saying that if I'm banging in my hammer inside my house and somebody moves into the chutzner next to me, into the same chutzner, he can complain about the noise if he has
only if
he's
he
fastidious?
has a special a special condition, or if he claims if he claims that he can't tolerate the noise, and he has to be able to demonstrate that this is a condition that he has. But he then quotes the Chazon Ish, and let me just quote. I'll show you where the Chazon Ish is. I'm pointing it here with my cursor. He says, "Nira de'ein divrei harivash ela ba'osa davar she'eno ikar dira, kemo ba'osa ariga v'chayotze bo she'ein ze matzui b'chol adam v'lo barov b'nei adam." That we had seen this Chazon Ish quoted in the Imrei Yaakov itself. He says the only time the Rivash says that a neighbor can protest is only when the person, the noisemaker is doing something which is not a regular household activity, such as he's got a loom in his backyard and he's doing weaving. And that's not something that is commonly found in most people's backyards. Aval im osed devarim sherov b'nei adam osin. But if he is engaged in an activity that most people engage in their home, and sometimes these activities make noise, running an appliance or speaking with the members of their household, and this disturbs the sick person, then the neighbor cannot protest even if that neighbor was there first. In other words, there has to be an establishment of normalcy. If this is normal activity, that, like I told you, that example before when, we were just speaking at a regular decibel level in my in-laws' kitchen, and the windows were open on a hot summer night, and the neighbors were disturbed by the fact that we were speaking at, 9 o'clock in the evening, right? That is not something that they can protest. You cannot inhibit normal residential activity, is essentially what the Chazon Ish qualifies. He says a neighbor can say that I cannot tolerate your noise, but only if it's an irregular noise. So you taking into account all of these issues, he comes to the punchline at the very end of the essay. He says, Vida'od, Dehecha dehamazgan poel bekol ra'ash gadol shelo kederech ha'olam. He says, if you have a particularly clunky and noisy air conditioner that is noisier than most other air conditioners, Dinispar, he says, Dinispar dimyesh sham choled dibiyado la'akva l'kuli alma. As we clarified that if a person claims that he has an illness, he does have a right to protest. Dinze amor gamim kvar hechsik bazeh v'hachololo machamiyat. He says the sick person would have a right to protest even if he was initially silent. Mikol makom lo havi chazaka bazeh da'afti yeshtam nezikim demol bahem chazaka. He says no person who's got an appliance that makes noise can claim that he has a chazaka, that he has precedent, that has, because the neighbor originally allowed it and didn't protest. He says, Aval b'makom choli lo mo'il, but that's not going to help if a person claims that he's gotten sick. So he says, so therefore, bottom line, and he gives us 4 points to conclude this halacha. He says, A, Aleph, Imrash hamazgan hu kiragil ba'olam, efshar limchot negdo gam im hashachen hu adam choleh. If the noise that the air conditioner makes is normal, it's an accepted decibel level that all other air conditioners make, so then you cannot protest if your neighbor operates his air conditioner, even if you have an illness, because that's considered, like the Chazon Ish had said, a regular household activity. Number 2, im harashu yotzei dofen mishar hamazganim, bazeh im hashachin hu chola biyado la'akev. Number 2, if the noise is irregular, this is a particularly clunky air conditioner that is making is noisier than most. So then, if the neighbor is ill and he says, I cannot sleep, I cannot function because of your air conditioner, then he has a right to protest. Number 3, im hashachen eino chola, rakstam mafriya lo harash, if the neighbor does not claim illness, but rather he claims that it's a nuisance. This is a nuisance. Provided that it is an unusually loud air conditioner. So this is a machlokas. in the poskim whether a person is allowed to use a claim of noise as a source of damage. And remember, we saw that some of the Rishonim hold that noise is not a factor at all, and some hold that it is. Ve'im hamazgan nimtza beveiso uvirshuso nira diachol lomar kimli. And especially if the unit is still on his property, where it's self-contained within his property, so then the neighbor who owns the air conditioner has a right to say that despite the fact that this is a noisier air conditioner than normal, I know that it's a nuisance, but as long as it's not disrupting your life, I do have a right to paskin like those poskin who say that noise is not a factor. And then finally, number 4, im hamazgan hu bechatzer hashutfim nami yeshnam kama rishonim hamatirim. And finally, even if the unit protrudes out into a common area, okay, then even in that situation, there are a number of rishonim who still claim that noise is not a factor that can be protested. Ve'efsher diochel lomar gam bazeh kimli b'tzarchim. It could be even in that situation, a neighbor can say, I, the air conditioner owner, paskin like those Rishonim, who say that noise is never a factor. Ulam kol zeh ikar hadin. So, but everything that I have written in these concluding 4 points, that number 1, when a person claims illness, that he can't function, he can't go to work, he can't, right? In other words, this has created a disruption in his life and it's compromising his health. So then you definitely have grounds to protest your neighbor's activity with the vital caveat that it has to be an abnormal noise. If it's a normal noise, and this is really the line of delineation. If this is a normal, what would be considered to be an acceptable household activity, like the operation of a vacuum cleaner, or the operation of and this, of course, this is what annoys me, is going back to these leaf blowers, is because, I was having a meeting yesterday in my house, and it just so happened, it was my own landscaper, came to my house and starts doing the leaf blowing. And it's unbelievable how noisy these leaf blowers are. And I'm thinking to myself, especially today, when so many people have their businesses in their homes, it's really a disruption. There have been times when I've been giving a shiur on Zoom, and the leaf blower comes, and I can't give the shiur, or it's an extremely disruptive noise that's distracting for me, and it's distracting for all the other people that are listening. So this is, yeah, I think that's what you have to say. But,
Sorry, could you repeat that, Rabbi?
So what Brian's asking, isn't this within the bylaws, the municipal bylaws, that as long as the municipality recognizes that this is an acceptable activity and it's an acceptable decibel level, then you really can't protest. And I'm agreeing with Brian. Because the very first qualification that Rav Stern gives is a neighbor cannot protest even if it's disrupting his life because of illness or the like. He says you cannot protest as long as it's a regular household activity. And unfortunately, leaf blowing is considered to be a regular household activity, at least in our municipality. I would imagine that there are some municipalities around the world where these leaf blowers have been outlawed because they're so darn noisy. I don't know, but I just don't know. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that if the neighbor claims that it's compromising his health, then he certainly can protest, provided that. Sorry. if it's a regular household noise, no one can protest, even if he claims that it's compromising his health. If it's an abnormal noise and he's ill, it says it makes him ill or compromises his health, then he is allowed to protest. Number three, if the noise does not make him ill, does not compromise his health, but only serves as a nuisance, and it really bothers him and disrupts his lifestyle, so then there's a machlokas in the poskim, and you have to work it out. But he says, and then the final thing is, he says, Avol vadai dilamaisa ra'oi lasos lifnim mishuras hadin ulamaites harash b'chol ma de'efsher limnoat sa'ar mishcheno. He says, what I've written up until now is halacha lamaisa, where sometimes a neighbor may be making an annoying noise that is allowed by the municipality, and it's a regular household activity, but that's according to the letter of the law. He could claim, well, I paskin like those poskim who say that hezek shemia lav shmei hezek, that causing damage through loud noises is not a form of damage. But obviously, a person should try to always go above the letter of the law. If you can minimize the amount of annoyance and nuisance that you're creating through your noise, you should try to do that if your neighbor is claiming that it's causing him some kind of discomfort or nuisance. So that's how he ends the halacha, that it would be lifnim mishuras hadin for you to try and be more accommodating to the best of your ability. Okay. Yeah, he doesn't point that out, and I guess it also it probably has to do with what is regular household activity. In other words, it will be dependent upon the time of day. At 3:00 in the morning, most people are not vacuuming the carpets, right? And certainly at 3:00 in the morning, if the neighbors keep their windows open and all of a sudden you start operating heavy appliances, then I think there would be grounds to say that this is abnormal activity, even though it's normal activity during the day. I know there's a story about Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, when he was living in New York, he stopped using an alarm clock because he knew that with the density where he lived, because he would wake up very early because he wanted to learn Torah, but he realized that his alarm clock was actually probably waking up some of his neighbors. So he wouldn't operate his alarm clock. He trained himself to wake up without an alarm clock because of that reason. Now, is that lifnim mishuras hadin? Possibly. The alarm clock is going off on his property, and he can say that noise is not considered to be a factor. But, you learn from that you have to try and be sensitive to the fact that other people want to sleep. Other people, there is this concept of gezel sheina. You're not allowed to steal someone's sleep time, right? That's a form of theft if you're going to be waking them up. So that probably has to be taken into consideration as well. Although we haven't seen him say anything like that, but it stands to reason that it falls under regular use. Okay. Let's see. We should probably do some of the likutim, which we haven't seen yet. So let me take a look at that. Okay. Ruvain rotza lahamid tanur shel nachtom samach lebeis Shimon. So here's a case. Ruvain wants to set up an oven, a baker's oven, on his property, but it'll be adjacent to Shimon's property. Uvechol yom eze shaot ole ashan harbe. He says, and every day, as a result of his using a baker's oven, a certain amount of time over the course of the day, it produces a lot of smoke. Va'afilu im yasu aruba gavoa lo yo'il. And even though it's going to, create a vent, this still is not going to completely alleviate the problem. Ayin mashakasav b'shut shuras shai simin taf mem. He says, I refer you to a certain tshuva sefer who discusses this issue. Again, this is, maybe I'll take a look at that for tonight and see if there's some good nuggets that I can present for you for that for tomorrow. Kol. You have to be careful about noises. Yesh lihimana ma'achrazos beramkol b'sha'os shaderech b'nei adam lishon. So he quotes from the Sefer Pischei Choshen, which is a 20th century contemporary Sefer. In Yerushalayim in particular, how many of you have walked down Mea Sharm and all of a sudden you start hearing a ramkol, you start hearing a car driving that has a loudspeaker on top of the car, making a public announcement. Have you ever heard those when walking through Yerushalayim? Is Wayne on the call today? Do they still do that? I don't see Wayne on the call.
He's not here, but I've certainly heard it.
Yeah. So those are not really regulated, right? I think the authorities look the other way because they realize that it's one of the ways that people receive their news. They'll have a car drive through the neighborhood and say that there's a levaya today for so-and-so, or that people have to be careful about a certain product, and sometimes they're frivolous, sometimes they're not frivolous. But he says you have to be careful about using a loudspeaker and during hours of the day when people are normally asleep. You're not allowed to use a loudspeaker when you know that people are going to be wakened by it. Now, what about the fact that some people may work night shifts and may be sleeping during the day? That doesn't seem to fall under any kind of defensible argument, because remember, you have to go according to what standard tolerable use is within a neighborhood. Since most people are awake during the day, even though I wish that the leaf blower would not start at Sunday morning at 7 a.m., right? But since a lot of people are awake by then, but again, sometimes they push the envelope and they come there even earlier. Let's see. Haka'a uleinin kol rash mazgan shemerfilum biyadu lakevai biurim. He says, I refer you as far as the noisy air conditioner to the biurim. And then finally, he says, Beis haknesa shepolim bo bekayitz mazganim o ma'avririm b'yeshatonim shahadavar mafriya lahem. He says, if there's a synagogue in the city or in the town, and it operates a big air conditioner or lots of fans in the summer, and the neighbors are complaining that it's making a lot of noise, he says, Ein zeh taina. He says, this is not a valid argument. Rav Vosner says, the kaven shehu davar ragil v'shimush nafotz lahakel hachom. He says, since this has become a standard accommodation to help people tolerate the heat, al ha'istanis laharchik atzmo. The fastidious person who is offended by the noise it's his responsibility to distance himself from something that has by now become standard use. So it all depends upon what is considered to be regular use of the living space or the office space. Once someone comes in and creates a noise that the neighbors are not used to, that's an actionable issue. And even then, there's a machlokas haposkim as far as how actionable it is. But if something is considered to be standard use in that neighborhood, you cannot protest. Okay, so we'll hold it here for today.